Welcome everybody to Constellations Conversations. I'm Robert Rowland Smith and I'm joined by Nicola Dunn. Hello, Nicola.
Hi, Robert.
Today's subject we thought would be a kind of a big one, actually, love and hate. We touched on the notion of looking for love before, but love and hate is a bit different from that. And I'll say a couple of things about it. And you made the point before we started recording, Nicola, that love is spoken of a lot more actually than hate is. And of course, there's lots of books written about love, and there are lots of films made about love, and there are probably lots of theories about love too. Hate seems sort of relatively neglected as a theme, as a concept. I mean, people write about, resentment and, difficulties with other people and conflict. And of course, we're very much aware these days of conflict on a global scale and enmity or rivalry or competition. It's surprising how little the word hatred or hate is used even in contexts of warfare. Actually, people talk about an enemy and combat and fighting, but it's still surprising actually how little the word hate is used in those contexts too, as well as interpersonal contexts. And it makes me wonder if actually hate is a little bit of a taboo word. It's like we're a little bit afraid of it. What are you going to say to that, Nicola?
I would agree. In kind of modern language, I think hate it's generally distilled into, as you said, resentment or aggravation or irritation. But the purity of hate, I think, is seldom talked about.
Yes, I agree. And it's almost as if it's one stop along a continuum which ends with the word evil, which I think is also something which we're very chary of deploying, because it connoted with all sorts of superstitious, religious, dark, existential, metaphysical material. And it feels to me like hatred is kind of not the same, but it's kind of edging in that direction, as though if we talk about hate, we're talking about something a bit too supersized for human life somehow. It's just a bit beyond what everyday experience is.
And I think exactly as you're saying, that there's a finality about it. There is a sense that perhaps the relationship has reached a terminus.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yes. Well, let me pick up on that and try and make a distinction, or a point at least, which is the following. So I wrote about this in the last book I wrote, and I came up with this formula, and I've just remembered it, and see if it makes any sense to you. It might be nonsense now if I try and think about it. So my hypothesis was that nobody begins with hate. They begin more in a state of love. And if you think of our early development as children, as babies, we begin on the kind of positive side of things, in love rather than hate. Now, in the work of Melanie Klein, famous psychoanalyst, post-Freudian psychoanalyst, she quite controversially actually writes about hate among babies actually. But even she says it's not the primary emotion that infants feel. It's always a reaction. So hatred isn't something you present with or arrive with. It's something that results from an experience. So in the work of Melanie Klein, hatred can arise really through a sort of extreme resentment on the part of the infant when they're not fed or picked up, whatever. And Melanie Klein, uses very strong language, and she writes lots about envy, for example. That can lead the even very young child to, hate the parent, hate the mother in most cases. But whether you agree or not with that or not, the bit I extract from it is this idea that hatred is a secondary rather than a primary emotion. It arises from something else. Like, we don't begin by hating people. We begin because of a cause. There has to be a cause. Whereas, and this is pretty speculative on my part, I'd argue that you can love people without a reason. Or maybe it's sentimental of me, but it's as if, and I think in Constellations, it seems to me that the field and the system has a bias towards love. It begins with love and wants to end with love, and hatred is a diversion or a digression or a depletion of love on the way to that. So that's an opening salvo. You can kick it back if you wish.
Beautiful, Robert. And I was thinking, I agree with you. Hate often arises out of distress, despair, a range of other experiences. And in a constellation, I think what do constellations do? They hold up a sort of filter of the system. And in shining love through that filter, they often reveal hatred, they reveal disappointment, they reveal longing, all sorts of things come to light. But it's actually through the combination of love being present, and in a way that it shows where there are pockets of the absence of love, where love either hasn't been able to reach or hasn't been able to be taken in.
Yes, exactly. I really like that, and I'll pick out two words you used there, the absence of love and the disappointment. And slightly recasting what you've said, it's as if hatred arises as a kind of extreme disappointment that love hasn't taken place or love has been cut short in some way. We wanted love. Love was held back from us or not available to us. And so we kind of resorted to hatred, almost therefore as a kind of defense against the disappointment of lost love or a love that wasn't possible. You asked me before this session, have I ever hated anybody? And the honest answer is yes. And I feel a bit ashamed saying it because I think we think of love as a kind of virtue, I suppose, and hatred maybe not exactly as a vice. It's not like gluttony or lust or avarice. It's not something you'd be proud of ever saying or admitting to, but I will readily confess, I have hated. I can think of a couple of individuals, and I think anybody who's hated anybody knows instantly who those people are. But in both cases I'm thinking of, I would contend that the very initial contact with those people was hope for a love, hope for something deep and meaningful and kind and warm and loving. And actually, the hatred arose based partly on the dashing of that love against the kind of rock of disappointment.
It's a great way of describing it. And, I think many people will admit to sort of surging moments of hatred. And I think it has the same kind of bonding quality as love. And maybe it's just that, both exist on a sphere which spins in different directions. And one day you can feel love, and if love goes wrong, then it's possible for one or both parties to feel hate. It's relational.
Mm. Well, the word bond is obviously a key one in constellations and systemic work. And when you use that word, it makes me think, if love and hate are both forms of bonds, they're united in that. One is a negative and one is a positive bond, like, electrons or whatever they do. Obviously no scientist. But it's as if, as you say, they've got spun the wrong way round, and it could rotate, clockwise. Now it's rotating anti-clockwise. But actually, in a strange way, there's a similar energy. And obviously, it's a connecting energy. And we can be just as exercised by people we hate as people we love. And maybe paradoxically, even more so. We might spend as much mental and emotional energy, silently cursing people we hate or rewriting scenes that we've had with them or projecting forward scenes with them so that we can give them a piece of our mind or humiliate them in some way.
Yeah. And I think there is a sense that perhaps hatred comes out of, as you say, this kind of longing for something, a longing for something that didn't happen.
Yeah.
And that may or may not be apparent to the other person. And it can even come out of a casual remark, but it was a remark that perhaps didn't consider the other, or a longing for a contact. We'll see that in constellations often, won't we? A longing for a contact, perhaps from a parent who's grieving,
Yeah.
Or whose own life has been such that their capacity to kind of attach to another is very reduced.
Mm.
And so then the individual, the child, the adolescent internalizes that as some sort of inner deficit
Mm.
that's been seen, and how painful that is.
Yeah.
Because it feels like something is being deliberately withheld.
Mm.
So important.
And I wonder, in that deliberate withholding, whether an aspect of hatred is also a sense of loss of control. What's one of the things that's so hateable about the hated person is that they seem to have an agency beyond oneself. They seem to be living and breathing and making decisions and doing stuff in the world that isn't as we would have prescribed. And at its worst, the person we hate most is the one who's thriving more than us. So there's an element of kind of jealousy perhaps in it as well,
Yeah, and we have iconic figures in our worlds who are targets for hate,
Mm.
often because of perhaps their lack of consideration of others,
Yeah.
making decisions that are potentially really hurtful, painful for others, and there's a sense that somehow they're we use the word narcissistic often, their
Mm.
viewpoint on life enables them to charge forward without considering others in a way that just triggers all of our own wounding
Yeah.
and being ignored and treated badly.
Yeah. And it makes me think in systemic terms about the place of the hated person in the system or in our personal system, because you're describing it in such a way that makes me think we wish the hated person to be excluded. We wish them away. We wish to banish them, or wish they were in exile, and moreover that everybody else agrees with us and that they could be sidelined forever. But then our preoccupation with them keeps drawing them back in. We bring them in because we can't resolve this place that they should have. And in constellations, where we have extreme negative reactions, abreactions, adverse reactions, often the most healing thing is actually to give them a place rather than to try to keep expelling them and finding that they're just actually worming their way back into the heart, kind of thing. And this phrase, which is a standard phrase in a constellational sentence, I see you, can be very restorative, actually, in a kind of hatred relationship in a constellation.
Yes, you're describing this wonderful kind of constellations like web, where the individual may want to punish the person who's treated themselves or others very, very badly. They don't want to let them go often, so they want to keep them on the outskirts of that web. So they want to deny them the presence of being centrally included, but at the same time, they're not benign.
Mm.
There's a lot of activation happening in the constellation.
Yes, there is a lot of activation, and it's much more active. I mean, I remember having a conversation with a friend some years ago. We were debating whether love and hate are opposites,
Right.
and because they're often thought of obviously as opposites. And this friend said, I wonder if actually the opposite of love is not hate, but indifference. And I thought, yeah, that's a very good shout, because in constellations, as you say, hatred is actually active. It's not indifference. It's almost the opposite, actually. I'm very different. I'm very concerned. I'm quite preoccupied, quite exercised by the person I hate. I'm interested.
Yes. And,
Yeah.
and actually aroused, not in a sexual way, but
Yeah.
emotionally aroused by the relationship. It is very active and on fire.
Yeah.
And indifference has a kind of forgetting quality to it.
Yes, exactly. And I suppose, it reminds me of that Nietzsche quote, which is the best revenge is to live well. I don't know if you know that phrase, but I mean, there are kind of various formulations of the similar thought, I think, in the history of ideas. But the best revenge is to live well, because if you revenge yourself or take vengeance on somebody you hate, then you're going to be aroused in that non-sexual way by them kind of perpetually. But actually, the best way is to move on and to kind of live your best life, to use the phrase of the day, phrase of our times.
To actually activate your word, which is indifference, to
Yeah.
not be a central part of your life.
Yes.
Also understand that I'm sure you've seen that in couple constellations as well, where I think working with hate is a lot easier than working with disdain, because there's the sort of
Yes.
light, the sort of the warmth, the almost the activation has sort of distilled down into some grits which are disdainful, because there is something colder and more expelling in disdain.
That's such an interesting thought, Nicola. There is something almost nihilistic about disdain, isn't there? It's like, well, it is colder. I've removed myself from this. I'm not going to be drawn into any form of engagement here. I'm just sort of looking down from above. It's a form of judgment, actually. And judgment, as we know in constellations, is probably, well, if not the least helpful, certainly one of the least helpful sentiments really to adopt.
Yes. So I sort of think in some ways disdain shouts, "You're not even worth my hate."
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And of course, we're talking a lot about the sort of hate side,
Yeah.
but of course, we're also interested in what is the balm for hate.
Mm.
And I guess love in its fullest, purest, most spiritual form. And we
Yeah.
know love to have so many different forms.
Yeah.
But love is bigger, broader, wider, deeper.
Mm. Yeah. In that kind of passageway, that from hate to love, the balm that you described there is a sentence I sometimes try in constellations when one person hates the other, but very simply. And that's to give them the sentence, "You're the same as me," or "We are the same." And the point of that is twofold, really. One is, certainly in psychoanalysis, the kind of understanding of psychoanalysis, sort of pre-Melanie Klein in Freud, is we only really ever hate something in somebody else which belongs to us. So we are basically projecting something onto them. So, and it's the thing in us which we least like or least value. So I hate person X because person X is manifesting that bit of myself which I wish I had expelled in some way. So I locate it in the other. And that would be the sort of fairly standard understanding in psychoanalysis of what hatred is. So in a sense, hatred is never really hatred towards the other. It's always a kind of inner psychic struggle of some kind, tension. In constellations, I think this phrase, "we're the same," or "you're the same as me," has a bit of that idea from psychoanalysis, I think, in it. But I think it's more the liberation that comes from this sense that I'm no better or worse than you. Whereas disdain, as you're saying, does have that lofty, that haughtiness, to kind of, as you say, rather dead haughtiness to it. But at least if you can get to the "we're the same" statement, there's a kind of melting, I think, that goes on of that hatred and the balm that you describe.
And I think because constellations are about ultimately about inclusion. And so in a sense, building on the sentence you've said, something like, and if I had been you, it's likely I would have done exactly the same.
Yeah.
And I think I agree with you that the hate among peers or colleagues or people of the same generation has one element to it and may have that projection. Hate which is directed towards a parent often has this deep longing for that it was replaced with a pool of love.
Yes, that's right. And often you talk about parents. I was also thinking about couples, because I think the relationship with parents goes through phases, doesn't it? Love and hate. And particularly among teenagers, there's a kind of presentation of hatred sometimes. I was also thinking of couples, and I remember a very vivid constellation I ran with a man who was representing himself in the constellation, actually. I don't always do that, but in this case, he was. And there was a representative for his wife. And I asked him essentially to ad lib. I said, I feel there's quite a lot of negative energy. What's the sentence you would like to say to your wife's representative? And he filled with emotion and said simply, I hate you. And obviously that was sort of distressing in all sorts of ways. But one of the things it got me reflecting on was in relationships, in relationships that fail, whether it's always known from the beginning that they will fail, that we, at some level, unconsciously, presumably, we are already selecting a person we can ultimately leave. So, 90% of us loves them, thinks they're great, 10% below the waterline knows at some level they've already got the flaw, the defect, the thing, which buys me a get out of jail free card at some point should I need it. So as if the exit sign has been lit up, as you enter the room, obviously that, this is very subliminal and so on, but it did make me wonder that whether actually, in a certain sense, a lot of relationships, the demise of a lot of relationships can be predicted or knowable, is known even in advance because the hatred is sort of wired in.
Yes, I mean, I would agree that when a couple come together, when they resonate so strongly that they decide, actually, we're going to explore this, to whatever depth it takes us, that they know at an unconscious level exactly what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And it's less about that, huge erotic carnal charge. It's more about if you want to say, the lessons, the experiences, the repetition of, perhaps child-parent wounding, whatever it is, that will reveal itself, which is now currently unconscious. I mean, no, I don't think anyone gets together with a partner thinking they're exactly like my mother or my father.
Yeah.
At least the wrapping looks different, which is always very attractive. But they discover that actually they have come into this dance, and that what's going to be acted out is something that they know very well and have not yet healed within themselves, regardless of whether it means that they're treated so badly that something has to emerge in their own defense or in pursuit of their own survival that is necessary for them to have to continue in the next phase of their life. So I know, probably like you, some friends who've been in, pretty unrelenting and incredible relationships. And it took them a while. And then eventually something surged up within them. And they were able to agree that they were done and that they could leave.
Yeah. We're talking about love and hate here as absolutes. As you were talking, I was wondering about degrees of love and hate, actually. Hate feels more like an absolute thing. Either you hate somebody or you don't. You're hating somebody a bit. I'm sure it's possible, but it sounds a bit odd. And the reason I was thinking about that, again, was this idea of what couples know at the beginning of their relationship, overtly or covertly, about its ultimate end, if there is to be one. And you and I, as constellators, will often explore with couples, particularly married couples, the question of how much commitment was made when they committed to each other. Or, the question I often ask is, when you married X, how much have you married X? And it's quite an interesting question because, it leads to, most of me, yes. A bit of me didn't. A bit of me was still attached to my ex or my father or something else or my culture. And, and I say that because love and hate aren't necessarily absolutes. Maybe we can think about them as kind of dials almost that can be dialed up and dialed down a bit. And we know, in everyday relationships, there are days when you don't love your partner quite as much as other days or moments and phases. Yes, you love them. This is a sort of bedrock in the way you love your children, but your children can really piss you off. And that some days you It's hard to restrain yourself in terms of, wanting to shout at them or whatever.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I like your continuum, or your circular coil, however we want to look at it. But there's something about it reaches into those elements of, like and dislike, isn't it? So you can love someone, but you can dislike certain behaviors they have.
Mm,
And of course, I guess disliking, which becomes kind of sort of hardened,
yeah.
almost like a blacksmith's kind of forge, can still be fiery, and dislike can lead into hate.
Mm,
As you say, the greater balance of you is on the love side. And so you love someone, but you dislike these things. And if one doesn't pay accurate attention, that balance can slip over.
mm,
There is more dislike moving into hate and less of the love.
mm. Yeah. I mean, I was thinking of that song, I Don't Like You, But I Love You. You remember that famous? I won't try and hum it. Because that's a sort of different theory in a way. That's almost says love and like are really very different things. They spring from a different source. Whereas I think what you're saying is, no, that's not quite right. Enough dislike can shade into hate, and perhaps enough like can shade into love. I'm thinking of sort of 19th century novels as well, where there are lots of marriages of convenience, where it's a good match. They come from the right class. There's the right amount of money. They kind of like each other, but then the heroine or hero sort of says, has a pep talk with themselves to say, I'm sure love can grow over time, kind of thing. Of course, I'm compressing, centuries worth of literature into one trope, but you know what I mean. But those are two very different models. One is love and like are very different. The other is loving is an extension of kind of prolonged liking over time.
And I think that takes us sort of delicately into love at first sight and love at second sight,
Mm.
which happens in all relationships.
Yeah,
So love at first sight could be low or high, could be, incredibly compelling, or a low simmer. But the more important part is the love at second sight.
yeah. Yes, and my earlier thesis would be that there's no such thing as hate at first sight, that hate is always at second sight. Now I'm beginning to question that a bit, whether there is such a thing as hate at first sight. And my argument would be, well, only if that initial reaction to somebody is based on this psychoanalytic idea that that other person that we hate at first sight is somehow manifesting a quality or representing something which for us is a trigger, and it's not really about our relationship with that person or even that person at all, but for whatever reason, they've walked into the crosshairs and now they've triggered something.
Yes, I would agree with you. I think hate at first sight is only possible without knowing the person.
Yeah.
Because then they're a good enough hook for
Yes.
you. It's a partial recognition of something. It's not a full understanding of that person.
I suppose the same is true of love at first sight. Almost by definition, love at first sight is based on no data, really.
It's about not knowing. That's what's so compelling about it, because the
Yes,
potential for fantasy is so high.
exactly. Potential for fantasy is so high, and it's a bit like the distinction made in philosophy between faith and reason. Like love is a kind of faith insofar as you don't need reasons for it, or it can operate without empirical data. I love this person even though I've just met them. Or I read a story the other day actually of a couple who got engaged on their first date and are still together, 35 years later, I think it is. Which suggests again that love doesn't come from the same wellspring as other as other judgments that we might make, and there's something rather beautiful in that, I think, and that it does play to the idea of soulmate and so on, although I'm a little bit skeptical about that, but nevertheless maybe there is something in it. And by the way, Nicola, I should say I'm conscious of time. We should probably begin wrapping up before too long, but I think I interrupted you.
No, just to say that I think, uh, we may feel a lot more freedom about talking about love, but perhaps getting to know our little gritty pockets of hate is equally productive. And it's about bringing the two together.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is what we would do in a constellation.
Yeah.
So thank you everyone for listening and watching. Please like, share and subscribe. That helps to keep us motivated. And if you want to get in contact with Robert, you can find him at robertrowlandsmith.com, and you can find me at NICOLADUNN and we hope you'll listen with us again. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. And let me just add something actually briefly, that if any of our listeners, watchers would like us to tackle a subject, please suggest it on YouTube or email us for that matter. We'd be very happy to take requests. We're sort of constellated DJs in that respect. So, okay, thank you.